On your feet, all of you now." Gannon Rourke stood at the front of the training bay with his hands clasped behind his back, watching 64 alien cadets scramble off the floor mats in a chaos of limbs, tentacles, and chitinous legs. The bay smelled of ozone and the sour tang of Vressy sweat. Half of them were still tangled in the restraint webbing from the failed drill. The other half hadn't even made it that far. He didn't raise his voice. He never did on the first day. "My name is Chief Instructor Rourke. I am human. Some of you know what that means. The rest of you are about to find out." He let the silence work. A Thessari cadet in the second row, tall, storm-gray, ridged face, straightened to full height and locked amber eyes on him. Good. At least one of them had spine. "You are Cohort 19 of the Veteran Joint Tactics Program at Korath Station. 64 cadets from 11 species. By graduation, fewer than 30 of you will remain. That is not a threat. That is the historical average." A Gorathi cadet, squat, heavy-shelled, 4 arms folded across an armored thorax, let out a low grinding sound that passed for skepticism in their species. Rourke marked it, noted the cadet's position. Third row, far left. He'd remember. "You have all passed your species-specific combat certifications. Every one of you ranked in the top percentile of your homeworld programs. You are, by every metric your governments use, elite." He paused. "That means nothing here. Your species-specific training taught you how to fight alongside your own kind. This program will teach you how to fight alongside everyone else, or it will wash you out trying." The Thessari in the second row hadn't blinked. Her amber eyes tracked him with a predator's stillness. Rourke had read her file. Cadet Vorith Tan, daughter of a fleet commander, top of her class at the Thessari War College, expected to breeze through. They always expected to breeze through. Rourke turned to the wall panel and brought up the cohort's aggregate scores from their intake assessments. The holographic display bloomed in cool blue, columns of data scrolling across species designations. The numbers were consistent with every cohort he'd seen over 11 years. Species internal scores uniformly high, cross-species coordination scores uniformly dismal. "Look at these numbers," he said. "Your individual combat ratings are excellent. Your tactical reasoning under pressure is above standard. Your species-specific teamwork metrics are outstanding." He tapped the rightmost column. It glowed red. "Your cross-species integration score is 14%. The minimum for field deployment is 70. That gap is why you are here, and that gap is why most joint tactics cohorts lose a third of their cadets before week 6. The Gorathi in the third row ground his mandibles again. Rourke let it go. The first week was about establishing the terrain, not winning individual skirmishes. "First drill begins in 90 seconds. Pair assignments are on your displays. Move." He watched them scatter. The bay's lighting shifted to simulation mode, cooler, harder, the kind of flat institutional light that stripped away comfort. Rourke had requested that change 3 years ago when he'd taken over Cohort 14. The previous human instructor had run the program for 6 years before him, and the one before that for 4. Humans had held the chief instructor post at Korath for 19 consecutive years, not because the Veteran Council preferred humans. Because no other species had produced an instructor who could get cross-species cohorts above the 70% integration threshold consistently. The reason was simple, and it was the reason most alien administrators didn't want to hear. Humans were the only species in the program's history that had no instinctive species loyalty override in combat. Every other species, Thessari, Gorathi, Vressy, Kelthari, all of them carried some version of it. A neurological bias toward protecting and coordinating with their own kind under stress. It was biological. It was deeply encoded. And it was the single biggest obstacle to joint species operations in the field. Humans didn't have it. Humans had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting each other in shifting alliances that cut across every biological boundary. They formed bonds based on shared experience, not shared genetics. And that made them, paradoxically, the best teachers of cross-species integration in the galaxy. Rourke had never explained this to a cohort. He never would. They had to learn it by doing, or it didn't stick. The first drill was a standard contact relay, 4 cadet fire teams clearing a simulated corridor under timed pressure. The pairings were deliberate. Rourke had spent 3 days on them, cross-referencing species interaction profiles, combat styles, and most importantly, known friction points. He put Thessari with Gorathi, Vresi with Kelthari, every pairing designed to force cadets into working with the species they were least naturally compatible with. The results were exactly what he expected. Team 7, Vorath Tan and 3 Gorathi cadets, imploded in under 40 seconds. The Thessari's combat instinct was speed, precision, and vertical movement. The Gorathi were ground-anchored, slow, and armored. Vorath cleared the first corridor section in 6 seconds flat, leaving her team behind. The Gorathi, unable to match her pace, defaulted to their shell formation and stopped moving entirely. The simulated hostiles flanked them through the gap Vorath had left open. Rourke watched the replay on his display. Vorath's individual performance was flawless. Her team score was 0. Team 12, a Vresi communications specialist paired with 2 Kelthari close-quarters fighters and a Thessari medic, managed slightly better. The Kelthari twins moved in perfect sync with each other, but treated the Vresi as a piece of equipment rather than a teammate, positioning her behind cover without consulting her about sight lines. The Vresi, whose species communicated through subsonic vibrations, couldn't make herself understood over the Kelthari's rapid-fire vocal coordination. The team completed the relay but missed every secondary objective. Team 3 was the worst. 2 Thessari cadets and 2 Brelak, a bioluminescent species that navigated by sonar in low-light environments. The Thessari relied on visual coordination. The Brelak's sonar pulses disrupted the Thessari's concentration. Within 30 seconds, both species were actively interfering with each other, not out of hostility, but because their fundamental perceptual frameworks were incompatible. The corridor exercise devolved into 2 cadet teams running separate operations in the same space, nearly shooting each other twice. By the end of the first day, all 16 teams had run the drill. Average completion rate, 31%. Average cross-species coordination score, 11%, 3 percentage points below intake. They'd actually gotten worse by trying. Rourke dismissed the cohort at 1800 hours and stayed in the bay alone, reviewing footage. He pulled up the individual performance data for each cadet and overlaid it against the team scores. The pattern was identical to every cohort he'd trained: individual excellence, collective failure. The instinct to default to species-specific tactics under pressure was overwhelming. It wasn't a choice. It was wiring. His job was to rewire them, not by erasing what made each species effective, but by building something on top of it, a layer of cross-species awareness that could override the default under stress. It took time. It took repetition. And it took the kind of pressure that made cadets hate him before they understood him. He'd accepted that trade a long time ago. Day 2 began at 500 with a formation run. The track circled the exterior of Korath Station's training module, a 3-kilometer loop in variable gravity. Rourke ran it with them. He always ran with them. Not to prove he could keep up, at 43, with a rebuilt left knee and scar tissue across both shoulders from a deployment he never talked about. He wasn't outpacing anyone. He ran with them because leadership was proximity, and proximity under discomfort was the fastest way to establish it. The Gorathi cadets struggled immediately. Their species wasn't built for sustained locomotion. They were ambush predators, explosive in short bursts but inefficient over distance. By the second kilometer, 4 of the 8 Gorathi were falling behind. Their shells scraped against the track's surface with every labored stride. The sound was like grinding stone. Rourke dropped back to run beside them. He didn't slow the pace. He didn't offer encouragement. He just ran beside them, matching the grinding rhythm of their heavy legs, his breathing steady and visible in the cold air of the exterior module. The Gorathi cadet from the third row, Rourke had learned his name was Dreth Kalosi, ground his mandibles and kept moving. His shell was slick with condensation. His forearms pumped in an awkward cadence that was clearly costing him energy he didn't have. Every 100 meters, his stride shortened by another fraction. His compound eyes, amber and faceted, flicked toward Rourke and then away. "You're compensating with your upper arms," Rourke said, not looking at him. "Drop them. Let your legs do the work. Your center of gravity is lower than mine. Use it." Dreth's mandibles clicked, irritation, maybe surprise. But he dropped his upper arms to his sides and his stride smoothed out immediately. Not faster, but more efficient. The grinding sound softened. He stopped losing ground. Rourke said nothing else. He moved forward to the next struggling cadet, a young Gorathi whose shell had barely hardened, fresh from the juvenile molt. The cadet's legs were shaking. Rourke ran beside her for 200 meters without speaking, then said, "Shorter stride. Match the cadet ahead of you. Don't race your own legs." She adjusted. The shaking steadied. By the end of the run, all 64 cadets had finished. The Gorathi were last, but they finished. Rourke noted that Vorith Tan had finished first by nearly a full minute, running alone at the front of the formation with no one near her. Her stride had been effortless, a Thessari in their element, built for exactly this kind of sustained movement. He made a note of that too, a different kind of note. The second drill that morning was a modified version of the contact relay, same corridor, same hostiles, same pairings. But this time Rourke added a constraint. No cadet could advance more than 5 meters ahead of the slowest team member. A hard leash. The effect was immediate and ugly. Vorith Tan went rigid. She completed the first section in her usual 6 seconds, hit the 5-meter limit and stopped dead. Her Gorathi teammates were 15 seconds behind her. She stood in the corridor with her hands at her sides and her jaw locked, waiting. The simulated hostiles repositioned. The clock ticked. When the Gorathi finally reached her position, the tactical window had closed and the hostiles had fortified the next section. She had to clear it again, slower this time, adapting her approach to match their pace. Her team score improved by 4%. Her individual satisfaction dropped to 0. After the drill, she approached Rourke in the bay. Her posture was rigid, a Thessari dominance display, shoulders squared, chin elevated, amber eyes fixed. The ridges along her face had darkened, a stress response in Thessari physiology that they couldn't suppress. "The leash constraint is tactically illogical," she said. "It eliminates my primary advantage and reduces overall team output." "Your primary advantage is irrelevant if your team is dead behind you," Rourke said. "With respect, Chief Instructor, in a live engagement I would not be paired with Gorathi ground units. Thessari tactical doctrine. Thessari tactical doctrine operates inside Thessari forces. You're not in a Thessari force. You're in a joint species cohort, and the engagement you're training for will put you beside species you've never fought with, in terrain none of you have seen, against threats none of your doctrines anticipated." He met her eyes steadily. "The leash isn't a handicap. It's the point of this entire program." She didn't answer. She turned and walked away, her stride stiff with controlled anger. Rourke watched her go and felt nothing but familiarity. He'd had this conversation with the best cadet in every cohort he'd ever trained. The best ones always fought the constraint hardest. They had the most to lose by slowing down. They also had the most to gain by learning why. The rest of the first week was a controlled demolition of species-specific habits. Rourke ran the same drills with the same pairings, adding one new constraint each day. Day 3. Teams had to maintain verbal communication across all species present, using a common trade language that none of them spoke natively. The Kelthari, whose communication was near instantaneous within their species, were reduced to the pace of the Gorathi's slow, grinding consonants. Day 4. Scoring switched to a system where the lowest individual score in a team became the team score, eliminating the incentive to carry weaker members while outperforming them. Day 5, team leads were randomized, and Agorathi found himself directing a team of 3 Thessari who moved at twice his speed. The randomized leadership drill produced the week's first genuine conflict. A Thessari cadet named Vane Osek, smaller than Vorith, but faster, with a reputation for tactical creativity, openly refused to follow Agorathi team lead's positioning order. His argument was physiologically sound. The position was optimal for ground-anchored species and suicidal for a Thessari who needed vertical escape routes. The Gorathi lead, a veteran cadet named Thalix Bren, responded with a shell bristle, the Gorathi equivalent of drawing a weapon. Rurk was across the bay in 4 seconds, not running, walking, but a walk that made every cadet in the room stop moving. "Cadet Osek," he said, "state your objection." Osek straightened. "The positioning order places me in a ground lock without vertical egress. In a live engagement, that position would kill me." Rurk looked at Thalix Bren. "Cadet Bren, was Cadet Osek's concern raised before you issued the order?" Bren's mandibles worked. He raised it. "I determined that the mission profile required ground positions." "You determined?" Rurk's voice didn't change. "Did you ask him what position would serve both the mission profile and his species requirements?" Silence. "The answer is no. You defaulted to Gorathi tactical logic because it's the logic you know. Cadet Osek defaulted to refusal because compliance would have violated his species' survival instinct. You were both correct about what doesn't work. Neither of you tried to find what does." He looked between them. "Run the drill again. This time, solve the problem together before you move. I'll wait." He walked away. The 2 cadets stood facing each other for a long moment, a Thessari who needed the sky and a Gorathi who needed the ground, in a corridor that had both. It took them 11 minutes to find a positioning solution that served both species. The solution was ugly, improvised, and slower than either species' native doctrine. It was also the first time in the drill's history that a Thessari Gorathi team completed all objectives without a simulated casualty. Rurk logged the result without comment. Week 2 brought the first real fracture, not a breakthrough, a break. The kind that happened when pressure found the fault line and exploited it. The drill was a multi-team coordination exercise. 4 teams of 4, operating in adjacent sectors of a simulated urban environment, required to synchronize their movements through a shared tactical overlay. The overlay translated each species' tactical notation system into a common format. In theory, it worked. In practice, the translation lag was 3 to 7 seconds, just long enough to create confusion, and confusion under simulated fire created panic. Team 7, Vorith's team, was assigned the lead sector. They were supposed to clear and hold while teams 8, 9, and 10 advanced through the flanking corridors. The timing was precise. If Team 7 moved too fast, they'd outrun their support. If they moved too slow, Teams 8 through 10 would stack up behind them and create a bottleneck. Vorith moved too fast. Not by much, 3 seconds ahead of the coordination window, but 3 seconds was enough. Team 8's Kelthari fighters, reading the overlay lag as Team 7 already being in position, advanced into an uncovered corridor. The simulated hostiles hit them from the flank. Team 8's Vresi communications specialist panicked and broadcast a distress signal on the wrong frequency, which Team 9's Thessari medic interpreted as a retreat order. Team 10, 2 Brelak and 2 Gorathi, received contradictory signals and defaulted to a defensive hold, blocking the only extraction corridor. The entire exercise collapsed in under 90 seconds. Rurk called a halt and brought all 4 teams to the center of the bay. 64 cadets watching. He replayed the footage on the overhead display, the 3-second advance, the cascade of errors, the total breakdown. He slowed the replay at the critical moment. the 3-second gap between Vorith's advance and the coordination window. "Cadet Ton," he said, "tell me what happened." Vorith stood at attention. Her face was blank, the Thessari mask of controlled humiliation. The ridges on her face had gone dark again. "I advanced 3 seconds ahead of the coordination window, Chief Instructor." "Why?" A pause, her amber eyes flickered. "Because I assessed that the corridor was clear and the window was unnecessary." "You assessed wrong. Your assessment cost teammate a simulated casualty and collapsed the entire exercise." He let the words land. No heat, no volume, just the flat statement of fact that was harder to deflect than anger. The coordination window exists because your teammates cannot see what you see, move how you move, or process tactical data at your speed. The window is their speed, and their speed is the speed of the operation. He turned to the cohort. "This is the lesson that washes out a third of you, not because you can't fight, because you can't slow down. Every one of you was selected because you are the best your species produces. That means you have spent your entire career being faster, sharper, and more capable than the people around you. Here, that instinct will kill your teammates. The hardest thing you will learn in this program is not a new tactic. It is the discipline to operate at someone else's pace and make that pace effective." The bay was silent. 64 pairs of alien eyes on a human standing in the center of the room, speaking a truth that none of their species-specific academies had ever taught them. Vorith Ton's jaw was still locked, but something behind her eyes had shifted. Not acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in certainty. Rourke dismissed them. In the corridor afterward, Dreth Kalosi fell into step beside him. The Goratha's heavy gait shook the deck plates with a rhythmic thud that Rourke had learned to read, slow, and even meant Dreth was thinking. "Chief Instructor, Cadet Kalosi, the Thessari will not forgive the public correction easily. She doesn't need to forgive it, she needs to learn from it." Dreth's mandibles worked slowly, the Gorathi gesture of weighing something. "Among my people, a correction of that kind would end the instructor's authority. The corrected party would challenge physically. The winner would teach." "Among my people," Rourke said, "a correction of that kind is called doing my job." The Gorathi was quiet for several steps. His armored feet rang against the station's metal flooring. Then, "You are unlike the instructors at the Gorathi Combat School." "How so?" "They teach us to be stronger than our enemies. You teach us to be useful to people who are not like us." A long pause. The mandibles worked again. "It is deeply uncomfortable." "Good," Rourke said. "Comfortable means you're not learning anything worth knowing." Dreth's mandibles clicked once, the Gorathi equivalent of a dry laugh, and turned down a side corridor toward the barracks. His heavy footsteps faded. Rourke stood in the corridor for a moment, listening, then walked the other direction toward his quarters. Week 3 was when Rourke started the night drills, unannounced. Station alarm at 200, full tactical kit bay in 4 minutes. No exceptions, no excuses. The first night, 12 cadets failed to make the time limit. 3 Gorathi couldn't get their armor plates sealed in time. 2 Vresi tangled their sensor tendrils in their webbing. The rest simply didn't wake fast enough. Rourke said nothing. He logged the failures and dismissed them all back to their berths. The second night, 8 failed. The third night, 5. By the fourth night, all 64 were in the bay in under 3 minutes because the faster species had started waking the slower ones. He hadn't told them to do that. He just made the consequence of individual failure a team problem. The cadets who made the time limit but whose teammates didn't receive the same demerits, the same reduced scores, the same notation in their records. The incentive structure did the rest. Vorith Ton, who could be dressed and in the bay in 90 seconds, started setting her personal alarm for 60 seconds before the station alarm. She used the extra 30 seconds to wake the 2 Gorathi cadets in the adjacent berths, Dreth, and the young female whose shell had barely hardened. She didn't speak to them while doing it. She just pounded on their shells until they moved, waited until she heard the creak of armor plates unsealing, and sprinted for the bay. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't friendship. It was a rational response to an incentive structure. Rourke would take it. Warmth could come later or it could not come at all. What mattered was the behavior. Behavior, repeated under pressure, became instinct. And instinct was what held in the field when everything else fell apart. The night drills fed into the Week 3 tactical exercises, which were deliberately harder than anything the cohort had faced. Rourke introduced environmental variables, shifting gravity that changed every 90 seconds, atmospheric contamination that affected Vresi respiratory systems but left Gorathi unimpaired, lighting conditions that blinded the Brelak's sonar, but enhanced Thessari visual acuity. Each variable was designed to create an environment where one species thrived and another was crippled, and where the only path to mission completion was the crippled species trusting the thriving one to compensate. The trust was the hard part. It was always the hard part. Then came the communication problem that nearly broke them entirely. Each species had its own tactical sign language, and none of them were compatible. A Thessari fist close meant hold position. A Gorathi fist close meant prepare to charge. A Kelthari palm down was fall back. A Brelak palm down was sonar pulse incoming freeze. The first time they ran a comm blackout drill, Team 7's Thessari and Gorathi members gave conflicting orders using identical gestures, and the team split in half. Team 3's Brelak signaled freeze, and the Kelthari interpreted it as retreat, abandoning the Brelak in an exposed position. 2 simulated casualties, in a drill that wasn't supposed to have any. Rourke stopped the drill and gathered the cohort. He stood in the center of the bay and let the silence build until it was uncomfortable. "You have 48 hours," he said, "to develop a unified signal system that works across all 11 species in this cohort. Every cadet must be able to send and receive every signal. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care whose system it's based on. I don't care if it's ugly. I care that every cadet in this cohort can read it under fire with 0 translation lag." He checked his chrono. 48 hours. Go. He left the bay. He didn't help them. He didn't assign leaders. He didn't suggest a framework. The problem was theirs. The solution had to be theirs, or it would fall apart the first time real pressure hit. For the first 12 hours, nothing happened. Species groups clustered separately in different corners of the bay, each insisting their existing system was the most logical foundation for a unified standard. The Thessari argued for their precision gesture system, which used 26 distinct hand positions. The Gorathi argued for their impact-based system, strikes against the shell that could be felt through armor. The Kelthari argued that the whole exercise was unnecessary because their vocal coordination was superior to any manual signal. The Brelak pointed out reasonably that they didn't have hands in the anatomical sense, and any hand-based system would exclude them. The argument circled, species groups grew louder. The Kelthari twins started a competing demonstration that drew half the room's attention away from the Thessari presentation. A Gorathi slammed a fist against the deck in frustration, which the Brelak interpreted as a threat and retreated to the far wall. At hour 14, Vorith Tan did something Rourke hadn't expected. She walked to the center of the bay, sat down on the floor and said nothing. Just sat there, in the middle of the arguments, silent, her amber eyes half closed, her posture loose, her ridged face neutral, the most individually capable cadet in the cohort, sitting on the deck like she had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Within 20 minutes, the arguments died out. Not because she'd resolved them, because the sight of the cohort's best individual fighter sitting alone and quiet in the center of the room made the argument feel absurd. One by one, the voices trailed off. The species group stopped posturing and started looking at each other. Dreth Kalosi was the first to sit down beside her. He lowered himself to the deck with the grinding deliberation of a Gorathi who had decided something, and his mandibles stayed still. Then a Vresi communications specialist named Alin Voss crossed the bay and joined them, her sensor tendrils coiling quietly around her forearms. Then a Kelthari pair, moving in their characteristic synchronized stride, sat down on Vorith's other side. Within an hour, a working group had formed around them. Not led by any species, but anchored by the simple act of stopping and starting over. They began with the most basic question: what did every species absolutely need to communicate under fire? The list was short: rally, hold, advance, retreat, contact, casualty, acknowledged, 8 signals, that was all. 41 hours later, they presented Rourke with a unified signal system. It was crude. It was imperfect. Several of the signals required physical modifications that some species couldn't execute cleanly. The Brelax version of rally involved a bioluminescent pulse pattern rather than a hand gesture, which meant the system had 2 channels, visual and sonar. But it worked. Every cadet could send and receive every signal, and the system had been stress-tested in 3 informal drills they'd run on their own time. Rourke reviewed it. He found 4 problems: a timing ambiguity in the hold signal, a visibility issue with the Brelax pulse at range, and 2 gestures that were too similar in low-light conditions. He corrected them without explanation, handed the pad back, and authorized it for use. "This is yours," he said, holding up the data pad. "Not mine, not the program's. This cohort built it. When you deploy, this is the system you take with you." He set the pad down. "First comm blackout drill with the new system runs tomorrow at 600. Be ready." He didn't praise them. He didn't tell them he was proud. He turned and walked out. In his quarters that night, he pulled up the cohort's running scores. Cross-species integration had climbed from 14% to 38%, still well below the 70% deployment threshold. But the trajectory was steeper than any cohort he'd trained in 11 years. He allowed himself a single thought about that, then set it aside and went to sleep. Week 4 was when the cohort began losing cadets, not to failure, to honesty. 3 cadets requested voluntary withdrawal: a Thessari who couldn't adapt to ground speed operations, a Kelthari who acknowledged that solitary hunting instinct was too deep to override in the time remaining, a Brelax whose sonar sensitivity made sustained close quarters teamwork physically painful. Rourke met with each of them individually. The meetings were short, 5 minutes, sometimes less. He didn't try to talk them out of it. He didn't tell them they were making a mistake. He confirmed their decision, signed the withdrawal forms, and said the same thing to each of them: knowing your limits is not failure. It is the first qualification for command. The Kelthari, a young male named Essek Ran, barely past adolescence by his species standards, paused at the door. "Chief Instructor, do you ever have cadets who stay when they should leave?" "Every cohort." "What happens to them?" "They slow down everyone around them. Then the field sorts it out and the sorting is permanent." Rourke met his eyes. "You made the right call, Cadet Ran." Essek's secondary eyelids closed, the Kelthari expression of acknowledgement that bordered on grief, and he left. 61 cadets remained. Week 5 was the proving ground. The Koreth program's signature trial, the fracture exercise. A 72-hour continuous operation in a simulated multi-environment combat zone. Variable gravity, shifting terrain, hostile forces that adapted to the cohort's tactics in real time. The AI running the opposition was sophisticated enough to exploit species-specific weaknesses and, critically, cross-species coordination gaps. Rourke briefed them at 400, standing in the bay under the cold simulation, lighting with the full cohort in formation. "The fracture is designed to break your coordination. It will find every gap in your integration and drive a wedge into it. The opposition AI has studied your drills, your signal system, and your team dynamics. It knows your weaknesses better than you do." He looked across the ranks. The historical pass rate for this exercise is 42% of remaining cadets. I expect better from this cohort, not because you're special, because you've done the work. That was the closest he'd come to a compliment in 5 weeks. Several cadets blinked. Vorth Tan's amber eyes narrowed fractionally, processing, not dismissing. Dreth Kalosi's mandibles went still. The fracture began at 500. The first 12 hours were manageable. The cohort's coordination held through initial contact, through a terrain shift from urban to subterranean, through a gravity fluctuation that briefly rendered the Thessary's vertical movement impossible and forced them to fight on the ground alongside the Gorathi. That moment, Vorth Tan dropping to the Gorathi fighting level without hesitation, flattening her stance, adapting her attack patterns to complement their ground lock formation rather than competing with it, was the first time Rourke felt the cohort working as a single entity rather than a collection of species. Hour 16 was when the AI found the crack. It targeted the Vresi cadets with a subsonic disruption field, a frequency specifically calibrated to interfere with Vresi interbody communication. The 4 Vresi in the cohort went functionally deaf to each other within seconds. Elin Voss, who had become the cohort's primary communications hub, lost her ability to relay coordination data between teams. Her sensor tendrils went rigid with pain. She dropped to her knees in the corridor. The cohort's response was textbook species default. Instant, reflexive, beyond conscious control. The Thessari pulled into their own formation. The Gorathi locked shells. The Kelthari paired up. The Brelek retreated to sonar-safe positions. In 30 seconds, the cohort fragmented from 1 unit into 5 species groups, each operating independently, each blind to the others. Rourke watched from the observation deck, his hands behind his back, his face neutral. This was the moment. Every cohort hit it, the instant when 5 weeks of training collided with 1,000,000 years of evolutionary wiring, and the wiring won. The question was always the same. Who would break the pattern first? Who would override their own biology and reach for the thing Rourke had been building? Vorth Tan was pinned behind a barrier with 2 Gorathi cadets, Dreth Kalosi, and the young female with the barely hardened shell, whose name was Bren Koss. The Thessari formation was calling for Vorth across the tactical overlay, pulsing her designation, pulling at her, demanding she rejoin her own kind. Every fiber of her species-specific training was telling her to go. Thessari with Thessari, the formation that had kept her ancestors alive for 10,000 years. She didn't go. She looked at Dreth, she looked at Bren. Then she pulled out the hand signal system, the one the cohort had built together at hour 14 of that long night in week 3, and signed, hold, adapt, together. Dreth's mandibles clicked once, hard, decisive. He signed back, understood. They formed a 3-cadet cell, Thessari speed, Gorathi armor, Gorathi heavy weapons capability, and began clearing their sector. Not using Thessari tactics, not using Gorathi tactics, using something that was neither and both, a hybrid approach that existed only because these specific cadets had learned to read each other under pressure. It took 12 minutes for the rest of the cohort to notice what was happening. By the time they did, Team 7's 3-cadet cell had cleared more ground than any species group operating alone. The tactical overlay showed it clearly. A single mixed species unit outperforming every monospecies formation on the field. One by one, the other cadets began breaking formation. A Kelthari fighter joined a Gorathi team. A Thessari medic embedded with a Vresi communications pair, using physical touch to relay data that the subsonic disruption had blocked. 2 Brelak repositioned to provide sonar coverage for a Thessari advance team that had lost visual tracking in a darkened corridor. The cohort reformed not into species groups, but into mixed species cells, each built around complementary capabilities. The opposition AI recalculated. It had been trained on 17 years of cohort data, and 17 years of cohorts had broken along species lines under this exact pressure. It had no model for what was happening now. Its predictive algorithms flagged an anomaly and began adapting, But adaptation took time, and the cadets were moving faster than the algorithm could restructure. The cadets pushed through hour 20, hour 30, hour 40. The AI adapted, but it was adapting to a pattern that kept changing. Mixed species cells reorganizing on the fly, trading members based on terrain and threat type, using the hand signal system to coordinate across species boundaries that the AI expected to be impassable. At hour 56, the AI deployed its final escalation, a simulated capital-class threat that required the entire cohort to coordinate a single combined response across all sectors simultaneously. Historically, this was where cohorts collapsed completely. The scale of coordination required was beyond anything species-specific training prepared them for. No single species command structure could manage it. Vorith Tan, standing in the forward position with simulated debris in her hair and dye marker from a Gorathi cadet's wound on her uniform, turned to face the cohort. 60 cadets spread across a broken urban landscape, exhausted, battered, running on the dregs of 48 species-specific stimulant protocols. She raised her fist, the unified signal for rally. Every species responded, not because a Thessari told them to, because a teammate did. The final engagement lasted 41 minutes. It was messy. Two teams lost coordination briefly when a gravity shift caught them mid-maneuver. A Kelthari cadet took a simulated fatal hit covering a Vresi teammate, stepping into a plasma line that would have killed Elin Voss, and had to be marked as a casualty. It was the first time in the exercise that a cadet had voluntarily taken a hit for a member of another species. When it was over, Rurk stood in the bay with the full cohort assembled. 59 cadets standing, 2 simulated casualties seated to the side with their armor marked in red dye. He pulled up the scores on the overhead display. The numbers hung in the cool blue light. Fracture exercise completion rate 93%. Cross-species integration score at exercise end 74%. He paused and let the number land. The deployment threshold is 70. You've cleared it. The bay was silent. Not the silence of exhaustion, the silence of understanding. The silence of 61 cadets from 11 species who had just done something that no cohort before them had done at this point in the exercise. 74% is not excellence, Rurk said. It is the minimum standard for field deployment. You have 5 weeks remaining in this program. The goal is not to maintain 74. The goal is to make 74 look like the floor it is. He looked at Vorith Tan. She met his eyes. Something passed between them, not warmth, not gratitude, but recognition. The kind that exists between a person who is being forged and the person doing the forging, and both of them knowing it. Dismissed, he said. 500 tomorrow, we start again. The cohort filed out. Rurk stayed in the bay, alone with the scoring data and the simulation logs. He pulled up the moment Vorith had signed hold, adapt, together to Dreth Kalosi. He watched it 3 times. The way her hand moved steady, deliberate, no hesitation. The way Dreth responded, 1 click of the mandibles and then motion. Then he closed the file and began planning tomorrow's drills. In his quarters that night, the station's communication system chimed with an incoming message from the Veteran Council's Office of Joint Operations. He opened it. Chief Instructor Rurk, preliminary assessment of Cohort 19's fracture performance has been flagged for review. The cohort's 74% integration score at the 56-hour mark represents the highest score achieved at that point in the exercise in the program's history. Previous high was 61%. Cohort 11. Please provide a written methodology report for council review. Rurk read the message twice, then he typed a 2-line reply. Methodology unchanged. The cadets did the work. He sent it, turned off the light, and slept the way he always slept, immediately, completely, and with the alarm set for 4:30. The remaining 5 weeks of the program were not easier. They were harder. Rurk increased the pace, the the complexity, and the environmental stressors with each passing day, because he understood something that most administrators and most cadets didn't. Clearing a threshold meant nothing if the margin was thin. Thin margins collapsed in the field. What survived was depth, the kind of integration that held when the plan fell apart. The communication was cut, the terrain shifted, and every instinct screamed at you to fall back to your own kind. He introduced scenarios that required cadets to lead teams composed entirely of species other than their own. A Thessari commanding Gorathi, a Gorathi directing Kelthari, a Vresi coordinating Brelak through a sonar-disrupted environment using nothing but the hand signal system and physical proximity. He ran exercises where the objective could only be achieved if every species contributed a capability. No other species possessed Thessari speed for the approach, Gorathi armor for the breach, Vresi communication for coordination, Kelthari precision for the strike, Brelak sonar for the blind sectors. The Gorathi cadet Drethkalosi became the cohort's anchor, the steady, immovable center that other cadets oriented around in chaotic environments. His species' instinct for ground holding, which had been a liability in Week 1, became the cohort's most valuable tactical asset once it was integrated with Thessari mobility and Vresi communication networks. In Week 8, Rurk assigned him team leadership for a complex multi-sector operation. 4 teams, 3 species per team, 12 cadets under his command. Dreth's mandibles ground for a full minute before he accepted. "I have never led a team that was not Gorathi," he said. "Then you've never led a team," Rurk said. Dreth's mandibles clicked. He took the assignment. His team scored 81% integration, the highest single-team score in the cohort, and completed the operation 17 minutes ahead of the projected timeline. When the debrief ended, Dreth sat alone in the bay for 20 minutes, his compound eyes fixed on the scoring display, his mandibles completely still. Rurk, passing the bay on his way to his quarters, saw him through the window and kept walking. Some moments belonged to the cadet alone. Vorth Tan's transformation was quieter but deeper. The cadet who had run alone at the front of every formation in Week 1 began running at the center. Not because she'd slowed down, her individual performance metrics remained the highest in the cohort by a significant margin, but because she'd learned that her position in the formation affected everyone else's performance. At the front, she was a benchmark no one could reach. At the center, she was a pace setter everyone could follow. She never said a word about the change. Rurk never mentioned it. Some lessons didn't need to be named out loud. They just needed to be lived until they became natural. In Week 9, the cohort ran the final qualification exercise, a 48-hour operation that simulated a real joint species deployment scenario. Multiple objectives, shifting priorities, limited resources, and an opposition force that was no longer adapting to the cohort's weaknesses, but actively attempting to fracture their coordination using psychological and environmental pressure, subsonic disruption, gravity manipulation, lighting conditions calibrated to blind specific species, and false tactical data designed to trigger species default responses. The AI targeted Vorth first. It isolated her from her team using a terrain collapse, a simulated structural failure that sealed her in a corridor section alone. Then it surrounded her with opposition forces calibrated to her individual weakness profile. Slow, armored units that negated her speed advantage and forced her into the kind of grinding close-quarters engagement that favored Gorathi physiology. The simulation was designed to force her back to species default behavior, to fight alone, fast, and independent, to prove that the integration was surface level, that under real pressure the wiring would win. She held position. She didn't try to fight her way out. She didn't try to use her speed to escape. She signed contact, isolated, holding. Through the tactical overlay, a signal that told her team exactly where she was, what she was facing, and that she was waiting for them. Not fighting alone, waiting. Dreth team reached her in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. A mixed-species cell, 2 Gorathi, 1 Thessari medic, 1 Kelthari fighter, moving through collapsed terrain at a pace that none of their species could have achieved alone, but that the cell managed because each member knew exactly what the others could do and compensated for what they couldn't. The Gorathi cleared debris. The Kelthari scouted ahead. The Thessari medic assessed Vorith's condition the moment they reached her, minor contusions. Die marker from a near miss on her left shoulder, but functional. When they reached Vorith's position, she fell into the cell without a word. 5 cadets, 3 species, 1 unit. They cleared the sector together and rejoined the main cohort in 12 minutes. The final qualification exercise ended at hour 41, 7 hours ahead of the simulation's projected timeline. The cohort's aggregate integration score was 87%, 17 points above the deployment threshold, the highest final score in the Cadets program's 23-year history. Rourke stood in the bay for the last time with Cohort 19 in formation. 57 cadets, 4 more had washed out over the final 5 weeks, all voluntarily, all with Rourke's quiet acknowledgement that washing out was not failure but self-knowledge that would serve them better than a certification they hadn't earned. Final integration score, 87%, he said. You are certified for joint species field deployment. He paused. Some of you arrived here believing that your individual excellence was your greatest asset. It isn't. Your greatest asset is the cadet standing next to you who does not think like you, move like you, or fight like you, and who you have learned to trust anyway. He looked across the formation. 57 sets of alien eyes, 11 species, all watching a human who had pushed them harder than any instructor they'd ever had, who had corrected them publicly, who had refused to praise them when they wanted praise, and refused to ease up when they wanted rest, who had demanded they build something no species-specific doctrine had ever taught them to build, and who had never once raised his voice. The cohort signal system, he said, holding up the data pad, will be entered into the Cadets program's permanent tactical library as standard operating protocol for all future cohorts. Designation, Cohort 19 Signal System. He set the pad down. You built it. It carries your name. The bay was silent for a long beat. Then Dreth, the skeptical Gorathi from the 3rd row, the one who'd ground his mandibles on day 1, raised his fist. The unified signal for rally. One by one, every cadet in the formation raised theirs. Thessari, Gorathi, Vresi, Kelthari, Brelak, and 6 other species, standing in a room built for war, using a signal they'd invented together to say the one thing none of their languages had the same word for. Rourke stood at the front, hands behind his back, and watched. He didn't raise his fist. He didn't need to. The signal was theirs. It had always been theirs. Dismissed, he said. You're ready. The cohort filed out slowly, the way soldiers leave a place that has changed them. Dreth paused at the door and turned back. His amber compound eyes held Rourke's for a long moment, and his mandibles worked slowly, the Gorathi gesture of deep acknowledgement, the one their species reserved for the rare individuals who had earned the right to be remembered across generations. Then he inclined his armored head and walked out. Vorith Tan was the last to leave. She stopped in front of Rourke, her amber eyes level with his. For the first time in 10 weeks, her posture wasn't rigid or combative. It was settled, the stance of someone who had found a foundation that didn't require dominance to stand on. The ridges on her face were their natural gray. No stress, no performance, just the face she wore when she wasn't fighting anything. I understand now, she said. The leash. Tell me. It was never a constraint. It was a tether. She paused, choosing the words carefully, a Thessari habit that meant the words mattered. The point was not to slow me down. The point was to keep me connected to the people who needed me to stay. Rourke held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once slowly. You should have told us that on day 1, she said, and there was something almost human in her expression, not a smile, but the ghost of one, the faintest suggestion that her face was learning a shape it had never worn before. "If I had told you," Rourke said, "you wouldn't have believed it. Some things only make sense after you've lived them." She held the look for another moment. Then she straightened, inclined her head in the Thessari gesture of respect between equals, a gesture no Thessari had ever directed at a human instructor at Korath Station in the program's history, and walked out. Rourke stood alone in the empty bay. The simulation lights had shifted back to standard, warmer, softer, the kind of light that made a room feel like a room instead of a proving ground. The scoring displays still hung in the air, the 87% glowing in blue against the quiet room. He reached up and cleared the display. The numbers vanished. Then Gannon Rourke, chief instructor of the Korath Joint Tactics Program, 43 years old, 17 cohorts trained, not one of them told he was proud of them, walked to his desk, sat down, and opened the file for cohort 20. The intake numbers were the same as always. Individual scores, excellent. Cross-species integration, 12%. He read through the roster. 70 cadets this time, 13 species. A Thessari, of course. Always a Thessari at the top of the individual rankings. 2 Gorathi with combat decorations. A Kelthari who'd broken his species' close quarters record. A Vresi with the highest communications aptitude score in the last decade. Rourke closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The bay was empty and silent. Tomorrow at 500, it would be full again. 70 cadets who didn't know each other, didn't trust each other, and didn't believe they needed to. He'd stand at the front and say the same words he always said. He wouldn't tell them why a human held this post. He wouldn't explain what made him different from every other instructor they'd had. He'd just start the drill, and the drill would start the process, and the process, if he did his job right, would build the thing no lecture could teach. The first day was always the hardest, not for them. For him,